Hello, everyone. I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Jana Vandergoot. I'm happy she's also our first speaker of the 2019 Fall Lecture Series. So welcome. Jana is an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as well as an affiliate professor in landscape architecture at the University of Maryland College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. She graduated from, got her Bachelor of Architecture from University of Notre Dame, holds a Master of Landscape Architecture degree from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, and a Master of Architecture from my alma mater, the University of Virginia. She's also a registered architect and is the founding partner at Vandergoot SA+P Studio. Jana is interested in the intersection of architecture and landscape, being both disciplines. Her work and research focus on the ways in which buildings act as extensions of urban ecological networks, and specifically where this applies to vegetated landscapes. Her recent book, Architecture and the Forest Aesthetic, A New Look at Design and Resilient Urbanism, was published in January 2018. Please help me in welcoming Jana Vandergoot.
All right, so how is this? Yeah, personal enough? Well, I'm honored to be here, and I was just saying that even though I've been in DC for 7 years, I haven't had a chance to come up and see the new building. So it's really fun to see the environment here and also to feel a little jealous about it, because the architecture building in College Park is, let's just say it's different. And we're hoping maybe someday that we, have a wonderful donor and get a building like this. But it's great to be here and to have a chance to share my thoughts in writing this book, and then also my thoughts kind of a year away from its publication, and hopefully to have some good conversation both while I'm talking and after. So it's a small group. Feel free, even if it isn't a small group, feel free to jump in and ask questions as I'm talking. This can be informal, and I think the more discussion, the better. So Architecture and the Forest Aesthetic, a new look at design and resilient urbanism. The book is, in a nutshell, 21 case study projects that range from architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, to also art installations and cities and regions. And these 21 case studies that span the disciplines together define the forest aesthetic. And I'm kind of coining this word, forest aesthetic, to talk about a phenomenon that I see emerging in all of these disciplines together. So just a quick question, because I kind of like to know the audience. Are there people from architecture represented in this group? Yeah? And then landscape architecture? Yes, okay. And then there's also urban planning or urban design, urban planning? Okay, so there's a mix of architecture, landscape, perfect. Forest, as I reflect on the book after it's written and sort of move into the next phases of my work, I realize that the forest aesthetic is a model for designing. It's a medium, it's a physical medium, but it's also a metaphor for talking about design and for talking about different kinds of carbon cycles involved in urbanization. And I think the idea of a carbon cycle wasn't something that I realized until after writing the book, and reflecting on what the forest and what wood is. And writing the book really has gotten me interested in this idea of low heat urbanism, or urbanism that doesn't create so much carbon in the atmosphere, right? Urbanism that either sequesters carbon or minimizes the use of carbon. And I think, obviously, we all know here in this building that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases is a major issue of our time. And I think that issue can be addressed in many ways through design, but this is just one way of like inroading and thinking about the big issue of climate change and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to think about the forest, or think about what I call low heat urbanism. There are a lot of low heat building materials that can be found in the forest. Not all of the building materials shown here are forest materials, but certainly wood is a material from the forest, and it's a material that I consider low heat, which means that it has a comparatively low embodied energy, it's non-toxic, and it can even sequester carbon or deflect carbon from the atmosphere. So my more recent work involves low heat materials, and I just wanted to bring that into this discussion of the book to kind of keep the conversation current. I think the idea of low heat isn't necessarily a new one. I'm not really the first one to talk about the phenomenon. I like the term low heat though, because I think it describes something more current. If you look at these examples of different foundations, some of them are very ancient, Japan 4 BC, this pillar foundation, but there's a super rich history of building with low heat materials. And it definitely involves craft, because low heat materials are not necessarily permanent materials. They can be quite temporary. And sometimes the fact that they're temporary is a bonus. So, I wanted to show the spectrum of projects that represent this idea of low heat urbanism. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but it's kind of the latest conversation. So back to the book, 21 case studies. And I'm just going to flip through a few pictures of the case studies. I can't really talk about them all today. I've kind of cherry-picked a few that I think might spark conversation here at this school, and I'll talk about those. But I wanted to flip through some of the ones that I won't be talking about. So one of the chapters in the book is about cross-laminated timber, the first CLT ply scraper. So how many of you have heard about cross-laminated timber? Yeah, so it's a pretty, it's being talked about a lot these days, especially in the discipline of architecture. And I thought it was interesting then to talk about the first CLT ply scraper and what kind of building codes needed to be written in order to accommodate this in London. And so I think of this ply scraper really as building in order to hold carbon. Then there's Bosco Verticale, which is, I would say, the first skyscraper wrapped in a forest or wrapped in trees, and I talk about it as living carbon. It's carbon that's, it's alive. It hasn't, the trees or the plants haven't been harvested, or the carbon is still being absorbed. Carbon as infrastructure. So this is a historic project, the city of Canberra. We learn about it in our architecture survey courses, but I don't ever see it being talked about as, forest infrastructure. Usually it's talked about as the Garden City, designed by Walter and Marion Mahoney Griffin in 1911. But there's this alternate history of the city, and that is that before anything else was built, trees were used as kind of the survey pegs for the city. And today, the trees function as a very important kind of infrastructure. So that's carbon as urban infrastructure, or trees as urban infrastructure. Growing carbon, this is an example of this really bizarre forest in Italy. A forest that apparently Mussolini could see from Rome, which is great because those are his initials, Il Duce, those are his initials. So that was one of the projects in the book. Burning carbon, this is a charred garden, a really beautiful project in Canada in the middle of the boreal forest, which is a burn forest. It's a forest that goes through these natural cycles of burning. Studying carbon at Harvard Forest for 100 years. It's a forest, on first glance it's a forest, but you look at it more carefully and it's like the trees are these intensive care patients. It's totally wired. It's broadcasting signals to hundreds of other sites across the world. So that's studying carbon. And playing with carbon, this is an installation that I did with some students at the University of Maryland. So, a brief view of some of the case studies in the book that I won't talk about today. They're from all over the world, the case studies. And I didn't necessarily choose them to fit within any particular biome. I chose them because they all brought up important topics. But then I noticed when I did this world map that, in fact, they all fit within the temperate forest biome. So down in Chile and southern Australia, and then up in North America, Europe, Russia and China, and a bit in Canada. And so that's interesting to me when thinking about building with wood or thinking about the forest aesthetic as an approach to design. It's really an approach that fits within a biome, a global biome, and it may or may not be appropriate in other biomes, for example, tropical biome. So I wanted to be really intentional about the ways that I drew up the case studies as an architect and a landscape architect. One of the ways that I do research is by drawing projects, so by going through case study analysis. And so it felt like in order to be able to talk to my students about these projects and other designers that I had to draw them myself to know them, and that these drawings could also be used to help students understand the case studies. So these two drawings, a lot of the drawings in the book are active, what I call active drawings. So these two drawings not only show the physical project, so on the left is Harvard Forest, and on the right is the installation table in Rome that I did at University of Maryland. But they also show the things that are invisible. So on the left, you can see the Wi-Fi signals that are sending information from Harvard Forest all across the globe. And on the right is the way that the exhibit was manipulated and the paths that people took throughout the semester as the exhibit was up. And I could see those paths because the floor was wood, and you could start to see the scuff marks from muddy shoes. And for me, that was a really important part of the project. So that the active drawings, drawings as field conditions. I think I can say this because I'm an architect. I think that architects often think of the figure or the figure ground, like the Noli plan, right? And our buildings are this figure or this object. But I think it's important for designers to also understand what the field condition is, and landscape architects and urban designers have a better sense of that. But the field is this continuous fabric defined by a set of parameters, right? And out of the field emerges certain figures. So I wanted to carefully draw field conditions, different densities, patches, and mosaics. So here are a few field drawings. These are zoomed out field drawings, but I think you can also look at something like on the left, a building section cut through, a balcony with vegetation and light pouring through the window, and think of that also as a field condition, right? It's atmosphere filtering through, it's air, it's sound. On the right is thinking of the canopy of a park as a continuous field that has a texture and a grain, like a specific texture and a grain. So there's a waterway that runs through the park, and the denser canopies, the conifers and evergreen trees follow that waterway. Of course, I also did figure grounds because I think these are two examples of landscape figure grounds that show the tree, each individual tree as a figure. And I think that's also important to get this very quick kind of icon image of a project, right? You have the silhouette and it's kind of burned in your memory. I'm going to skip these for now, but plan drawings at different scales as well. So those are the drawings in the book. The foundational theories from the book, I tried to draw from different disciplines. So many of you probably know Stan Allen, architect, who is an architect and theorist looking very interested about a decade ago in field conditions, has written on that, and talks a lot about the forest as a metaphor or as an inspiration for urban design. So I talk about Stan Allen's work in the introduction. Ian McHarg, who was an ecological planner, University of Pennsylvania just celebrated the anniversary of Design with Nature, which was probably the best known publication by McHarg. And he talks about creative fitting. And I like that term, and I'm suggesting in the book that as humans, we really do live with the forest. And if we're going to be designing environments that fit, we need to consider the forest as part of our building material. So I'm calling on, the discipline of ecology, and then also looking to landscape architecture and design, architectural design, referencing Elizabeth Meyer from University of Virginia. She discusses the performance of beauty. And one of the things I suggest in the book is that not only do we live with the forest because we breathe that was nice. I've never had that before. At least he was fast. It was just like, that was good. Sometimes I wish I could do that, and then I just go like slinking around the back. But that I think the forest is also important to us because of the aesthetics, because we are attracted to the forest, and I talk about the kind of biological roots of that. So the structure of the book and the case studies is that I tried to assign each case study a design tactic, a new way of approaching design inspired by the forest aesthetic and inspired by the particular project. So you can see the list of design tactics there. This is the table of contents. So I want to talk about, I'll try to talk about three. I might skip over the first one for the sake of time, but I'll talk about three. One that's from the first section. The first two sections are really about the materiality of the forest. So projects that are literally built in wood, projects that discuss decay or the importance of decomposition in the forest. And then it moves into collective space, forest as a collective, a field condition rather than a single figure. And then the last sections are really a little bit more projective, thinking about the future. So I'll show case studies kind of from each section. So the first project, the design tactic, is the design make forest. And like I said, it's from the larger section in the book that's about building in wood. The design make forest is Hook Park. It's the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London's Woodland campus in the UK. And the campus is an ancient semi-natural woodland. In the middle, you can see the buildings designed and constructed by the students on the campus. And here are some historic maps of the campus. I think they're really beautiful maps. Here's Hook Park on the top. You see that Hook Park used to be a parish, then it was an estate, and now it's a campus. And if you zoom in a little bit on these historic maps, you see that the site has always been a productive site. It's called coppice. All these different locations are called coppice, which means you're cutting the forest trees so that they sprout up and make smaller stems, small diameter stems. And when agriculture was more present on this site, those stems were used for things like building fences or fodder for feeding animals. They were really valuable. And nowadays, that practice of coppicing and the smaller diameter trees are no longer considered valuable, they're waste products. So the amazing thing that the school is doing is that they're continuing the practice of coppicing, and they're also finding ways to use this small diameter round wood, and also green wood. Green wood is wood that hasn't been dried or seasoned, so it's more difficult to use, but it's cheaper. So they've really started to create a material economy for small wood that grows fast. And on the left, you see an example of coppice, sweet chestnut coppice. On the right is one of the projects from Hook Park, and you can see that, structurally there's some pretty painstaking details there. But I think, the takeaway for me in this project is trying to find an economy or a use for this waste product, what is now considered a waste product from the forest. Here's another project where they're using green wood and constructing with it. And the big shed assembly building is made all out of these scantlings that are basically, to keep a forest healthy, you have to cut or thin out the trees that are crooked or not doing well. And so you see a bunch of these waste trees there, and that's what they use to construct these buildings. And the beautiful thing is that they have to deal with these irregular structural forces within the scantlings. So what happens is when they join the wood together and they create a structure that has, good logic, they end up not with a square building, but a building like this. And I think it's beautiful because the building really almost literally represents the structural logics of the forest itself, right? The branching of the canopy, the branching of the trees. So I think there's something also quite poetic there, on top of the fact that they're trying to create new material economies from the forest. So here are just some drawings of a student testing out the structural forces, the bending forces of these timbers. So that's the first case study that's really about building with wood in different ways that designers build with wood. The next case study is about public space, and the design tactic here is, I call waterlogging. And I'm going to actually skip that. So this design tactic is connected to the Bos Forest in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And so up on the top, the kind of semicircular form, that's old Amsterdam, and highlighted in red is the Bos Forest. And what you can see in this historic map is that the entire country is constructed out of these polders, or these long, thin pieces of land. And many of you probably know the Netherlands is a country that's well below sea level. I think now it's like 14 meters below sea level. And so they've had to deal with issues that probably a lot of the cities in the East Coast will soon be having to deal with, and that is flooding and inundation from seawater. And so they have this long history of constructing land and water, and they do it with trees. They do it with trees both in old Amsterdam, where you see buildings and, more what you would say traditional, conventional urban design, but they also construct landscapes with this technique called waterlogging, that I'm calling waterlogging. So they build the architecture in the forest the same way, and they do it by taking logs, submerging them into the ground, and then very carefully engineering the water levels with canals and dampers. And so you see that Bos Park went from this polder system with canals to something that doesn't look like the polder system. It's a planted forest. And how did they achieve that? How did they make sure the trees would grow and the roots wouldn't drown in the water? They had to carefully engineer the water levels in the soil. In old Amsterdam, they also do waterlogging, but it's almost the reverse, where the logs that they sink into the ground, they have to continuously be submerged in water or they rot. And so while the forest has to not be submerged in water, the buildings have to be submerged in water. And it's all about creating these canals and doing this careful engineering. On the left, you see waterlogging. Historically, a group of people like driving a wood pile down into the earth by hand, and then later the steam piler to create the foundations of the buildings. And then on the right, you see workers doing exactly the same thing to build the forest. They're putting these live logs down into the water, and then in both situations, they're engineering the water levels. So I call waterlogging this very familiar construction technique that's used in the Netherlands. And I connect it to this particular construction technique to an idea about the Heemspark, which in the Netherlands it's like a folk park, a park that is made for just regular people. It's made as a place where anyone would feel at home, not just where someone who can pay an entry ticket would feel at home. So I'm trying to connect waterlogging to this idea of public space in the Netherlands, a construction technique. And on the left here, you see this is a special set of pictures to me because it's my father and his family in 1957. But what's great about the picture is that it shows the first forest succession, the first trees that were planted, that actually they were varieties of trees that sucked the water out of the ground, so that then the other trees like oaks and maple and beech could grow up. And the Bos Park looks nothing like this now. It looks like a full mature forest. But I think this snapshot from that time is interesting to show. The last case study, the design tactic is what I call the vertical forest biosystem. And this case study project is Bosco Verticale in Milan. How many of you have heard of this project? Yeah, it was interesting when I was writing the book. I kept seeing this project again and again and again and again on all of like the architecture websites, because it's like architects have been drawing these pictures of green fuzzy buildings forever, and somebody finally like figured out how to build it in the middle of a city. And this case study, I critique it pretty harshly in the book, but because I think there's a lot of stuff going on that doesn't totally make sense, but I also think there's something really important happening here. And that's the idea of a biosystem, that a building can be a biosystem. And in this instance, the biosystem is a vertical forest. And the other great thing, I think, about this project, it's not just that it's two like skyscrapers wrapped in trees that people call a forest, but it's part, for the architecture studio, Boeri Studio, it was part of a larger plan that they did for the city of Milan. It was called Bio Milano, the biological city. And they recognized that in this era, there's a new biome that's emerging, and that's the biome shaped by humans, right? It's prolific, it's everywhere. And what they were designing with Bosco Verticale was a biosystem that could function in a new kind of human forest biome. And that's what they were trying to envision Milan as, a new human forest biome. They had lots of different tactics, including like building out the metro forest, but Bosco Verticale, those towers were just one piece of this larger vision of a biological city. They envisioned that these towers could function almost like obelisks, right? These icons or these markers located at key metro stops that could help create this new vision for this city. And here I think the aesthetic piece of it is important, right? Even if the forest biosystem is, the trees really are intensive care patients, and, there's not much diversity in terms of the species, but I think there is an aesthetic function, and I'll talk about that later, and I think that's important. I also appreciate the conversation that the towers bring up, because it's a larger conversation about a wood, city built in wood, and wood cycles in urbanism. So these are some images of CLT, and I think that is emerging has emerged as a really important new construction technique for our cities. Boeri Studio was envisioning CLT as part of their scheme as well. So this is, they wanted to own that the industry that goes along with wood urbanism is a quiet, soft industry that could be co-located with things like housing, right? It's not an industry that has to be far away because it's toxic or super loud. I think that's really important. So they started to envision these adjacencies as part of the larger vision of the city, which is different than, say, the wood urbanism, of the 1800s in Chicago, where it's kind of a monoculture of wood, right? And nothing else is happening there, no housing or other programs. So I did talk about, I think the vision is bigger than what actually got built, but that's okay. They had a vision that the building would have like a hydrology, would have a water system where gray water could be recycled and used for irrigation. They never got that far, but I think there's great potential in that idea, and I wish, I hope someday that they are able to achieve that. One of the critiques of the project, and I'm curious to hear from you what your critiques are of this project. This is a drawing of another project that the same studio did as a proposal in China, and you see that it's a forest city, and there's a messiness and a heterogeneity to it, right? So that was part of this original vision of a biological city. These are elevations of Bosco Verticale, like the final elevation renderings, and you can see the messiness is gone. It's been, cleaned up and like compartmentalized and made more palatable. And I think that's probably where the project kind of lost its greatest potential. And I want to quickly tangent to another case study in the book, which is also in Milan, which is interesting. It's an installation by this artist-architect Friedrich Hundertwasser of tree tenants. He would install these tree tenants in buildings and build rooms for them. And he was really careful. When you look at the original plans for these buildings, he was actually choosing invasive species that we consider invasive species, like this ailanthus, which will grow anywhere, right? And I think that's interesting because at Bosco Verticale, they're careful to choose these trees that have been kind of pruned and cared for in nurseries for many, many years, and they're ornamental, and they don't have too many flowers so that birds come in. They don't really grow on their own. There's a lot of maintenance that's required. But I think that Hundertwasser was onto something. He wanted to choose species that would require no maintenance, right? Ailanthus can grow on the top of a mountain in a centimeter of soil. So that, and he also encouraged the messiness of it, right? As a vision. So this vision is very different than this vision of a vertical forest biosystem. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that if we are serious about making our cities biological and making the buildings that we live in more like biosystems, we need to get more comfortable with this image. So I talk about discomfort in the human forest biome, right? That Bosco Verticale really is a test to see how uncomfortable people will get in this new biome. And it's interesting, they said they weren't that interested in sustainability, they were interested in diversity. And they have a diagram in one of their books of all of the different species, and cockroaches, ticks, and rats are included in the species, because when you have when you have trees and water, you're probably going to have more mosquitoes. You might have ticks. You might have more wildlife, and with that, come all these other things. And so, if are we interested in that? Are we truly interested in that? The messiness.
What if the answer is no? I mean, my mother says no.
Yeah.
No to ticks and no to mosquitoes.
I do too. I do not like picking ticks off my kids, right? So I think that's why it's a great project. I think it remains to be seen if it's palatable, right? It's a test to see if the real estate will sell. I mean, the one of the tests too was like getting a developer to build it, to give up that much real estate to a tree tenant, right? They somehow got around that and convinced a developer that, it made economic sense. But now the inhabitants will also have to kind of vote on it. But I want to end with this image because there's this interesting phenomenon that's happening, and that is the image of the city of Milan is shifting. Vasco Vertichelli has shifted the image in this is in Porta Nuova, which is right off one of the metro stops. And the first thing you see is this like totally different silhouette. You never see that silhouette. Skyscrapers don't have that furry silhouette, right? And it's allowing other people, neighbors, to kind of test it out too. So there's a building now that's completely covered in ivy, and you can see the apartment. They're kind of letting the green overgrow, and it's a different aesthetic. It's a different aesthetic, and it's really the image, I think, of a more biological city. So that's it. I appreciated that question, and I would love to hear more from you all about that project or any other projects.
The only problem I have is I've always tried to keep living vegetation away from my house.
Yeah.
Because, and I'm old enough to have seen the effects of time.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that those buildings require a lot of maintenance.
Yeah, they do. And the cover image of the book is of a flying gardener. So they had to hire rock climbers who were also arborists who could come like once a month and do the maintenance so that like the tree branches that were dead and old wouldn't fall and like injure people, right, and freeze. But yeah, there's also this idea like the tree roots could seriously damage the structure if they start invading the concrete. And I've always had the same thing, right? If a tree's gonna grow by the foundation of my house, or if ivy's gonna grow there, I'm gonna rip it off right away, because I know what that means. So, and that's definitely one of the arguments about. It's interesting because landscape architects like James Corner, field operation, he talks about the horizontal surface, where designers are very comfortable with vegetation on the horizontal surface. We're really uncomfortable with vegetation on the vertical surface. So it's another test to see if we can figure out ways that we'll feel comfortable, ways that our buildings will hold up, or they will decay quickly and we're okay with that because they're cheap and we rebuild them. But I think it's a test to see if we're comfortable with the vertical surface being vegetated, or the vertical surface sharing it with the forest.
I just question those cantilevers, those concrete cantilevers, and then you're holding
Yeah, this.
dirt. And I've done buildings where I have had to hold dirt on the roof, and that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's just crazy.
This building was really expensive to build, right? So you have to ask, is it worth it?
Engineering gymnastics just to do something that you should do with very simple structure.
Right.
My opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's why, I completely agree. I think that's why I go back to this case study where you have Atlantis that has like really limber limbs that requires like that much soil and no water to grow. I mean, it grows on its own. It's like persistent, it's weedy, it'll show up anywhere, but it does have a lot of ecosystem value. Like it is filtering the air and noise. It's, has some wildlife value. I don't know if its roots are invasive. That would be a good question, but I think Hundertwasser, was a person who was also really concerned about the maintenance and like the viability. Didn't want to spend a ton of money on the structure, right? Yeah. Oh, okay.
In your opinion, do you see the vertical forest biosystem becoming more prevalent, like in the near future?
I mean, I think it's a popular idea. It's kind of gimmicky sometimes. The reason why I wrote about this project is I do see it everywhere. And now Boeri Studio is building a couple more, and HOK built one in Sri Lanka. So you are starting to see it more. Different versions of it though, like this version is a skyscraper wrapped in a forest. The forest is the skin of the building. You also see skyscrapers with like flying gardens inside, sky gardens inside. So it's like kind of a version of the vertical forest biosystem, a little bit more contained and controlled. I think that roof gardens in cities are also like an example of it, that are quite successful. They're just limited to a surface that's not as occupied. They're great for heat island effect. So I don't know if it will go this far, but I think there's potential for vegetation on vertical surfaces, right? To use these surfaces and make them more ecological, make them plug in to other ecosystems. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have two questions. One, I'm curious, how did you come up with this idea and fascination of forest as the material source?
Yeah, when it was part of my MLA thesis project, I had a studio. I guess I owe it to some of my professors there. I had a studio where we had to choose a kind of industry, whether it was like timber harvesting or salt hay harvesting or aquaculture, and I chose timber. So I did this project, and then I did my thesis project at Harvard Forest, which is this amazing, it was one of the case studies in the book. And I went out there, and Harvard Forest is there because it helps to clean the water for Quabbin Reservoir, which is the source of drinking water for Boston. So there's these aqueducts that go all the way into Boston. So the forest really is there and maintained. It's very urban, it's there so the city of Boston can function. So I think that's my thesis advisor was really insisted that I draw up case studies. And I think that's probably where it came from. And it's interesting because my husband, for his studio, chose aquaculture, and he just published a book on aquaculture. So I guess it was school. So those of you in school doing thesis projects, watch out. Anyway, yeah.
The second question is, I don't know if in one of your case studies you covered this, but the idea of reclaimed carbon. We did a project with
Yeah.
wood that was taken from buildings in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And I think that
I think, it's, there's not a chapter specifically dedicated to that, but the chapter on CLT and the wood cycle has a section that talks about, like, one of the Murray Grove, Wath discipline architects who designed that first ply scraper designed it, like, they were very careful to use one attachment type, like one bolted attachment type that could be easily undone, no welded connections at all, because they were interested in the building being reused at some point, the building being like either upcycled or downcycled or recycled. And that's one of the things that they argue is potentially one of the greatest benefits of CLT, that it's modular, so that it can go up and come down, it can be chipped, it can be made into packaging products. So yeah, I talk about that a little bit, but I think there's, that's a really rich topic area with a lot of really good case studies. Yeah.
Is there a case study where the footprint isn't square, and instead of having this forest as a skin, the building is actually building around the greenery instead? As in, the greenery is more focused on rather than the building.
Yeah.
The greenery is not the secondary thought. The secondary thought is the building.
Yeah, right. So the building is just like the enclosure for the forest environment. Yeah, and I think that, I'm sorry I'm not remembering the name of this project by HOK. I can't remember the name of it, but it's in Sri Lanka, and the building is really just, it's just a skin, so that you can go inside and be in a forest biome that's like somewhat mediated, right? The temperature is modulated, and I think the Sky Gardens and Skyscrapers, there's a great book published by Routledge called Sky Gardens, where I think, the phenomenon you describe, like those buildings show that up. It is still like the square footprint of a skyscraper, but, it's also reminding me of like the Hook Park, the first case study where you had the building that was more irregular. I think there's potential for that, and I think it's also, an important aesthetic consideration, right? That the forest is first the forest, yeah, as a fitting environment for us, and then an enclosure that helps mediate. Yeah, great.
I kind of wanted to go back to your question of what if people don't want to live with the discomfort of the forest in the city, and ask you to reflect on the opposite question, which is what happens when we have to live with the discomfort of having tried to totally remove the forest from the city?
Yeah.
We're facing real issues of retreat and possibly abandonment from a lot of urban areas in the next 50 to 100 years if we continue building in the way that we've been building and failing to suppress environment.
Yeah, and I think I'm really glad you asked that question. I think it's fundamental, right? It's like which discomfort can we deal with? Yeah. There's like the discomfort of not being able to breathe the air on most days because of the way we urbanize. And then there's the discomfort of like maybe having some extra mosquitoes or having to share your porch with 4 other species, So yeah, I think it's a good question, and the ideologue in me is like, of course we're going to live with the forest biosystem. That's the direction we have to go in, or we're all going to perish. But I don't know. I think we need to build projects like this so we can test it out and see what people decide. But yeah, my fear is that if we don't have forests in cities, and if we don't have the forest environment, we're done. Ian McHarg actually has this amazing quote in a chapter in Design with Nature in Cast and Capsule, and it's something like, we think we're so great, we think we're such stewards, taking care of the earth, eating the plants, like we need the plants, but did we ever stop to think they do not need us? They were here way before us. They don't need us. The reason why we exist is because plants cleared the carbon in the Carboniferous period, when coal was created. Tree ferns cleared all of the carbon from the atmosphere so that there started to be enough oxygen, and then terrestrial inhabitants started evolving, right? So plants don't need us, but we do need them. We really do. And I think we need to look hard at that. Yeah.
My original question wasn't just a NIMBY question where, I don't want my bugs in my room, because at the very beginning of your talk, you had an interesting diagram of a section, I think, from one of these things. It was like a density diagram of plants going through.
Yeah, like the field,
and
right.
I guess to address the issue, not to answer it, these are all design questions, essentially. And I think that about negotiating that continuum and finding the right place for a human animal, which has a very much more narrow band of temperatures and humidity and than some of the botanical things. Negotiating that spectrum is actually that's the question that you and the rest of us need to solve.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that I think that the key is not just botany but also hydrology. You said it's a shame that they didn't figure out the water business, But I think ultimately it's the water that does interpenetrate through, not only through the continuum, but through any membranes that keep outside from inside my temperature from the plant's temperature. And I think until, somebody, you would ask me, is this going to be more popular? It's the hydrology that's going to drive that market, because more and more we need to solve our rainwater, or our stormwater, and our water purification problems. And so I'm guessing if you overlay a few more systems on there, that helps provide some guidance.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you do when you've got a drought like you've had for 6 weeks? Suddenly you've got this bio.
Right, it's orange now, not green. Yeah, unless you have trees that are like ailanthus that are super drought tolerant and couldn't care less. But yeah, I mean, I liked what you said about there's this like there's a nuance like in negotiating the place where the discomfort is handleable, right? That it's maybe not one or the other, but it's a negotiation. Yeah, I don't know who is next, but.
Her grad student was hoping to be here to listen to this, and she's asking the questions about, she's working on this, and asking a question about basically what you're talking about, but not thinking about, of course, looking at indigenous cultures and how they would build in relation. And there are projects that are actually going on, I know in Senegal, there's a project going on right now where they're trying to actually bring some of the indigenous builds into the urban setting. And they're testing, just like they're doing here, but they're not building force, and they're looking at the materials that are being used as a part of that sort of organic system.
Yeah.
So I think there's sort of a balance that, like this is about sort of everything being green.
Right.
But I think there's a balance between building materials
Yes.
as well as the green. And so I'm wondering if you've looked at sort of that aspect.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, and that's awesome that the student's doing that thesis project. I think it's connected. We don't have to literally have the forest be. We don't have to have the forest be literal in the buildings. We can definitely build with the materials of the forest. And I think that from I like to think of indigenous construction as like it's all low heat. It's actually super sophisticated, like trial, we know this, like trial and error, figuring out how to use these unprocessed raw materials in a smart way so that the buildings last. Or like in Japan, at the Issei Shrine saying, the buildings aren't gonna last. We're gonna use these materials, we know that they're temporary, and part of the culture is to rebuild it every 20 years, because that's a value to human culture. So I think there's a lot there. And I didn't do it justice, but I tried if your student is interested in digging in, the first sections of the book, Built in Wood, there's 3 case studies there, and then Decomposition, those deal more with like the actual materiality of the forest. So whether it's like charred wood or mycelium bricks, which are, you probably know, like mushrooms the wood has to be decayed, and then that's becomes this construction material, or different species, the indigenous, like on the East Coast, the use of cedar shingles is just like, it's so beautiful, and it's indigenous, and it's a wood that can do well in like salty marine environments, and there's a certain way to craft the shingles. So yeah, I think going back to the craft, the vernacular, is one of the best things we can do, in this conversation. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question or like.
It's for her to respond.
Yeah. But so if she wants to know more, she might be, her curiosity might be piqued by those first 2 sections. But yeah.
It's more of a comment, but for most of the time that there have been humans on Earth, the forest has been a dangerous place.
Yeah.
And
periphery, right?
Maybe in the Renaissance, we started to control it and make a beautiful garden so we could have some control over nature.
Yeah.
And now it's like we flipped that, and we're thinking of forests being so fragile, and we're not. But yet, if we were to leave sections of the city, which you can see here in Baltimore, with no care and no maintenance, the forest will take over pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And nature will take over. The other thing that's interesting in all this, I think, your work is that 20 or so years ago, if you were environmentally conscious as an architect, there were people saying you can't use wood. You know, and now, like, well, wood would be better than steel, wood's better than aluminum. So as we learn about what's available, wood is very environmentally interesting. And I think the book seems like very interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. I like your comment about that the forest always comes back. You know, it's especially on the East Coast. It's like everything wants to be forest. Like the forest will always come back, and I mean,
Up to my sidewalk.
yeah, right. It's the last chapter called Spontaneous Ornament. It's like an ode to ecologists who study spontaneous vegetation in cities, and that's they don't want to call it invasive species. They're like the species that are going to come back after the disaster, you know, which is us building buildings or, you know, demolishing buildings. There are these species that are spontaneous and will come back as the pioneers. That's interesting to think about.
I do like your comment about forests being kind of notorious for being
Yeah.
spooky. I mean,
Right.
think about how many children's books or fairy tales
Yeah.
take place in forests.
There's somebody that's going to put you in an oven.
Yeah, so
Right.
that's a lovely relationship.
Or animals, or wild animals.
Right, and it's interesting that word forest, you talk about it a little bit in the book. It literally means like the outside space. Like it's the city, it's the part outside of where humans civilize. It's periphery because it was scary, and you know, a place where thieves were, right? Or a place where you could get lost and disoriented. It's dark, it's not light. So yeah, I mean, as an aesthetic, I think like the dense tropical forest. There was an interesting study by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan about environments that humans are attracted to. The dense forests, no, just as bad as like a desert, right? But it was like the woodland, the savanna, where you have like a lighter canopy with some long distance views. That was always attractive to humans. And I don't know if that's because like biologically we want to have some trees, but we want to have the views. So there's this like the woodland view. But anyway, yeah, I think the forest also has a stigma too, for sure. Yeah.
On your comment about the difference between West Coast and East Coast, could you please expand on that?
Yeah, so I always think of this gets back to hydrology. On the East Coast, I think the last time I looked at the map of rainfall, on the East Coast has seen something like a 70% increase in the average, except this year, like rainfall intensity. The last decade, right? So I think there's a map by the USDA. So like what happened in
very well-found data. I mean, 10 years is very little.
Yeah. So I think it's about the moisture and humidity levels, but also like in the Northeast and around here, in the 1800s, almost all of the forest land was cleared for agriculture. So like, yeah, here and like Harvard Forest up in Massachusetts where I was studying, all of that land that is now Harvard Forest in the 1800s was completely cleared for agriculture. And then the industrial food system, took over and farmers left Massachusetts. And since then, Harvard Forest has been studying the land and they haven't touched it. And forest has grown back consistently on the agricultural lands. And it happened here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. All of the land, like in Virginia, right? Shenandoah Valley, so much of that land was cleared. It was not forest. And when agriculture moved away, it returned to forest. So the land on the East Coast, and I don't know as much about the West Coast, but because of the hydrology and the soils and the climate, it always wants to return back to forest, the forest ecosystem.
Well, it's also the fact that we don't use wood as
Yeah.
an energy source.
Yes, yeah, that was another reason why the forest was cleared, right?
Yeah. Now we use carbon and nuclear.
Yeah.
And that allows much more forests to be around.
Yes.
But I didn't, you mentioned something about how it returns in the West Coast, and that's what I wanted.
I don't know as much about the West Coast climate, honestly, and I don't know, some of the climate is desert. I don't know if forest actually returns there. I just am more familiar with the East Coast, the history of forest succession in the East Coast. But yeah, it's probably something to look into next.
Well, it's very interesting because much more of the wood products that we're using in construction come from the West Coast.
The Pacific
Even
Northwest,
though we
yeah.
have much more wood here in the East Coast.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the Pacific Northwest, I think, is a very wet climate, and so that is probably a landscape that naturally goes back to temperate forest. Great. Yeah.
I just love there's so much looking up to Baltimore. Seeing that Atlantis growing out of the building, we got those all over.
Right?
But another thing that your talk brings to mind is some of the things that Baltimore is doing, like intentionally clearing vacant buildings. There's something called Project 4 that you might be familiar with. Where they're creating, what architects love, open space, green space, but then there's no associated maintenance plan that goes along with that.
Right.
So what did you find out about sort of designing for maintenance and designing those human interactions that you sustain?
Yeah, I think that's a super important question, and it was one of the things that I played with a little bit, like in a very cerebral way, in this exhibit on the right, the Forest Forum exhibit, which was that one of the best things I think of architecture is its signs of use and wear. So, when you see like muddy or handprints or like where a door has worn, that's beauty. So one of the things I think is the aesthetic idea that a worn building is not necessarily an unmaintained or bad building. There's that. But then there are real maintenance concerns too, I think. And that's where I would go back to like the Hundertwasser tree tenant, right? Or the spontaneous vegetation that I think if we're thinking about the forest aesthetic, we have to be really smart about the species we're choosing. And there are species that follow humans, right? They're like the ones that can survive in the chaos that we create. I don't know if there are, I don't know exactly how that translates to buildings, except to say that going back to like the vernacular indigenous architecture, some of those structures are quite temporary and can be put up in a day by a group of people, and then they go into decay, and that's fine. And then you build another one, and another one, and another one. So, maybe there's this idea of maintenance as like you do let it go into ruin, and then maybe it sits there and there's not a building there for a while until people decide to build it again. I don't know, but I'm going to think about that question more because I think it's really critical, and I don't quite have an answer. But do you have any thoughts as you here in Baltimore?
Yeah, we don't have that. People don't want to live next to vacant, decaying buildings filled with Atlantis trees.
Right.
It's like romantic as that idea.
No, it's like it looks unmaintained.
I feel both ways about it too. It's a fascinating image, and there's realities of encountering people experiencing homelessness in spaces like that.
Yeah.
People who have no choice but to go there and use drugs. That decay aspect of cities and architecture and forests, has a dark side.
It does, and it's kind of weird to glorify it when it's real. It has that real meaning, right? And I think it gets back to the dark side of the forest, right? That it is a sign that humans have left, or that it's not being maintained and it might not be safe. But it could also be a sign of, in the future, the stigma might be able to be removed. And in some ways, we're moving away from aesthetics and talking about like social issues that maybe architecture can address, but probably it's more like policy, But yeah, that's a good studio. We should do a studio together. I'd like to talk about that more.
I wanted to comment on the beauty of your visual presentations.
Oh, thank you.
Well, both the way that you described your work, but also how you showed us your work. And you made a comment about that you were intentional when you were producing the drawings of the book, that you were intentional about the way that you were drawing. And you mentioned an active drawing. And what struck me was that that all of the images that you showed us are active because they cause us to sort of wonder and to think about time. And I wonder if you could show us one image in particular where the active drawing was an act of discovery for you, rather than illustrating something that you already knew.
Right.
The way that you drew gave you back something that you didn't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like that question just having seen your beautiful exhibit, right? And knowing that that was at the heart of it. Let me think. Well, that's weird. This doesn't look like a very active drawing, but one thing that happened, like I chose the case studies, I had my running list, and then one day I was like, oh, I need to make a global map and locate them and say that I've located them all over the world and make sure I have one in each continent, whatever. So I did this map, and then I started getting insecure that I didn't have any examples in the tropical biome. So I was like, So I did this map. I thought, okay, am I gonna go to the tropical biome? And then I noticed like it's all in the temperate forest biome, and actually it's something I hadn't considered, but that helped me refine the idea of the forest aesthetic and say the forest aesthetic applies really, I can only say it applies to this biome because that's where all the projects that I'm seeing are, and that's where they're doing well. So yeah, I think I learned something, as mundane as these two drawings are, I think they helped me define the forest aesthetic. Yeah.
What about the one right before it, the exhibition drawing?
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not the one right before.
Oh, this one? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So this was interesting. When did I do this drawing? I did this drawing after the exhibit. It was like an as-built drawing. So what I don't, in the original book, there's the beginning drawing, in the book, there's the beginning drawing of the exhibit, which my students and I came up with this plan. We had the floor plan. And then as the exhibit went on and I realized it's interesting, the first couple days my TAs took everything that had been moved and they put it back. And I had to be like, don't do that. Don't clean up the exhibit, right? Like let the stuff go out and just take pictures, right? And so they compiled all these pictures and we were doing sketches every day of the different configurations. And then at the very end, I did this drawing, not everything is represented there, but the moments, the certain days that I remember when we were like most wanting to clean it up and we just had to back away, like there were these tubes hanging from the ceiling and they were screwed in, and the students figured out that if they twisted the tubes, the trees would like fall over and the shavings inside the tubes would spread everywhere, and we just let it go, And so, I didn't show the shavings actually, but I tried to show the most momentous occasions. What did I learn from this drawing? It was kind of an affirmation that the centers in the design, there was this wood wall and there was the altar, which had a video animation, that the centers that we had designed were actually centers of activity. Like the people did gravitate towards those centers. And maybe they wouldn't have, but they did, so that was fun to see, right?
Oh, that word, affirmate, that's...
Yeah. I kind of just went on and on, so I'll close it there. Thank you for that question. All right. Good. I really appreciated that discussion. It was great.